Well, for a little more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Professor of Political Science at the University of South Africa, Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
We saw a few weeks ago Joe Biden arriving in Saudi Arabia, and for him it was a very important mission given the energy crisis in the world. How important was this trip for South Africa's president?
Very important, but for different reasons. In our case, we try to build a bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia. And clearly from your report also, it is that Saudi Arabia appears to need South Africa now when it comes to the possible membership of BRICS. I think for South Africa, for both countries, both South Africa and Saudi Arabia, the change to renewable energies affects both of them very much. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it's the biggest oil producer in the world. And the changes away from the oil production and the oil-driven engines of cars and other types of transport means that it actually demands that they must reconfigure the economy quite dramatically. And the same applies to South Africa. So I think there's a common purpose in this, and the two countries are looking for opportunities in order to deal with that matter. That is one. I think there's other issues, and if we look at the list of ministers who accompanied President Ramaphosa, it's clear that it's a very broad spectrum or very broad agenda that they want to talk about. For example, one thing which doesn't receive a lot of attention, but I think can become quite important, is what is referred to as security. And that security is actually about military issues, because Saudi Arabia is looking for providers of military hardware for their own purposes, and they don't want to be relying only on the United States and other countries like that. So South Africa in the past did sell military equipment to several Middle Eastern countries. And I think that is one of the aspects which is mixed within what we are hearing as report back about what this mission or this visit is about.
Have our relations been always good with Saudi Arabia, and is this just a question of ramping things up?
Yes, the relations between South Africa and Saudi Arabia started around about 1995 already. President Mandela was very instrumental in that. The Saudis established the South African embassy in South Africa in 1997. So it is, in terms of the South African diplomatic history, quite an established relationship already. I cannot recall any serious problems between the two countries in diplomatic terms. It has been always not a very close relationship, but a cordial relationship. And I think what President Ramaphosa is doing now is trying to intensify or deepen this relationship because there's now new issues that South Africa can benefit a lot from.
On the political front, what's there to gain? We're talking BRICS. Is that a political arrangement, or is there a greater economic cooperation they want to get out of it?
Well, I think BRICS is in the first instance a political arrangement. When it was formed, it was presented as an alternative for the G7 and for the Western economic blocs or groups. And therefore, by implication, it has been defined in political terms. I think for Saudi Arabia, it is in order to, again, expand or to broaden their focus. They have been for many years very close to the US in terms of relations. They were, in a sense, sort of becoming almost caught in that relationship with the US. For example, if you think about the different wars, the Iraqi war, when their airspace and there was used by the American Defense Force or military during the time of the war in Kuwait in 1991, 1992. So in that relationship has been a very complicated one, but a very intimate one. And I think what the Saudis want to do is to expand and to reach the other big members of BRICS, and that is obviously the Russians and the Chinese. And then also India, because India is becoming more and more involved in the Middle East. For example, the Indian Prime Minister not so long ago had an official visit to Israel. And Israel has also become now very much involved in the countries very close to Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and others. So the landscape in the area around Saudi Arabia is quite dramatically changing over time, diplomatically, politically speaking. And I think given the fact that the fact that the Crown Prince is becoming now so prominent because his father is very ill and almost incapacitated, I think it's the beginning of a new era that he is introducing for Saudis in terms of their political relationships.
New era for sure. I just wonder, I mean, if there's a realignment of political alliances taking place here. Joe Biden doesn't seem very happy with the response that he got out of Saudi Arabia regarding oil output. And I just wonder I mean, the Saudis cozying up to Russia and China. Are we going to see a scramble for attention versus the US in the Middle East?
Well, that's very difficult to predict. But I think there is certainly, as I tried to indicate already, there is a realignment that is taking place. One can also include in this the position of Iraq and how much obviously the Americans were involved in that. Syria also. And then Iran, the fact that there's new negotiations taking place in Iran, and that although it's not part of the Middle East, but Turkey is a country very close to it and a very powerful country, that does also plays a very important role in these dynamics that are unfolding. So I would say what we've seen in terms of the landscape of these countries that I've mentioned now is that they are repositioning themselves. There is a situation unfolding which says it's not anymore completely dominated by the US. Some of these countries are now going in other directions, not so much just being dependent on the oil production and gas production and so on, but diversifying and modernizing their economies. Take, for example, the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, who are already looking at the post-oil economies that they are preparing for. And I think that is where South Africa is seen as possibly a very important partner in the African context, because it will give them indirectly access to other very important materials that they might need to use for that conversion or that modernization.
A difficult subject for Saudi Arabia is human rights. And I just wonder how other countries have to navigate these waters, because you have the whole Jamal Khashoggi drama that played out. There's a petition, I see, Amnesty International, 100,000 people saying they must lift the travel bans on human rights activists that Saudi Arabia has imposed. How do countries like South Africa navigate these waters, especially when one looks to South Africa to take the lead on human rights issues?
I think for those people who are very much specialists in South African foreign policy, they would say that it was only basically during the time of President Mandela that South Africa's foreign policy was primarily driven by human rights and values related to that. Since then, it has become mainly a policy driven by interests, and very specifically defined as national interests, which doesn't necessarily pay so much attention to the human rights or to the moral aspects. And that makes it possible for South Africa to have very close relations with China, for example, with Iran, and other countries that are accused normally when there's reports like at the United Nations Human Rights Council and others that they are violating human rights. But I think the definition that's being given to South African foreign policy is one which is very pragmatic and it is primarily driven about what is regarded as the primary interest for South Africa. And it's not from a human rights or moral point of view and values that our policy is at this moment to a large extent driven.
Professor Dirk Kotze, we're going to have to leave it there. Always great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for your time.